Hello, my name is Dr Simon Griffiths. I'm a reader in politics at Goldsmiths, University of London, and today I'm going to be talking about contemporary conservatism and putting it into context. The first thing I wanted to talk about was the relationship between ideas or ideologies, institutions and policies. And that's really important, I think, when it comes to talking about the Conservative Party in the UK, because it's both a party and it's an ideology. And there's an odd relationship between the two. Ideas and ideologies get carried along by names. There are people who call themselves conservative and see themselves as conservative ideologically because they are members of the Conservative Party. So there's this interesting relationship at the start. And Rodney Barker, who was at LSE for a long time, talked about the relationship between ideas and institutions as Constantinian, after Emperor Constantine. And he was the Holy Roman Emperor who converted to Christianity, and from then on the Roman Empire transformed into the Holy Roman Empire. So the institution, the empire, and the idea, Christianity, carried each other along together and gave each other mutual support and interacted with one another. And you get the same thing when it comes to conservatism as an ideology and the Conservative Party in the UK. So there's this really interesting relationship between the two in the British context that you don't get elsewhere. If you are a Conservative in Germany, you'll join the Christian Democrats, for example. So you've got this odd relationship between the two. And even in the UK, you get people who perhaps wouldn't necessarily describe themselves as Conservative, although they might, joining the Conservative Party, which forces them to describe themselves in a particular way. Lots of people have looked at what Margaret Thatcher did and the radicalism of her policies in the 1980s and described her as a classical liberal rather than a conservative. But as a member of the Conservative Party, she would describe herself as a conservative. And lots of people have seen her in that way. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about, this relationship between ideologies and institutions. And there's also this very, very big gap at times between ideologies and policies. What politicians talk about, the way they define themselves, the way they justify what they're doing, is often slightly different to what they do in practice. People call themselves conservative, as Thatcher did, and carry out radical reform. People call themselves socialists, but privatise industry. So you don't get the necessary link between ideologies and policies that you'll necessarily expect. And that's for all sorts of reasons, because parties are coalitions. There are compromises of power. There are compromises within coalitions, both between parties and within parties. There are external factors, the economic circumstances, which force politicians' hands at times. And also perhaps because there might be a gap between how they choose to justify themselves, how they choose to talk about ideology, and what they actually do in practice. So that's worth bearing in mind as well if you're thinking about conservatism as an ideology and the Conservative Party and what politicians do. And the last thing I wanted to mention in this kind of introductory section was the messiness of ideologies. And one of the ways in which ideology is often taught, particularly at A-level, is quite reductivist in some ways. It boils ideologies down to certain key concepts. So if you're learning about conservatism, for example, you might be told that it's got certain core concepts that are key to conservatism. It might be about pragmatism, it might be about tradition, it might be about human imperfection, the organic state, it might be about paternalism, the idea that conservatives have a responsibility for those who are less well off than them, or it might be about libertarianism, this libertarian tradition within conservatism. So the way ideology is often taught boils them down to certain key terms or key concepts. And what I wanted to suggest today is that ideologies are much, much messier than you're ever told at A-level. And it makes sense to boil them down. These are summaries. It's like a map of trying to understand this complicated world we're in. But there are so many more people taking part in these discussions, saying things that don't tidily fit into the maps we draw. Conservatives who say things that make them sound a lot more like socialists at times. Socialists who say things that sound very conservative. Ideologies are messy, they are contradictory, they overlap at the edges with other ideologies. And you'll see this in some of the things we talk about today. So that's another point to bear in mind when it comes to talking about any ideology, whether it's conservatism, socialism, feminism, liberalism, whatever else it might be. Ideologies overlap, they interconnect with one another, they contradict one another, and they are contradictory themselves. The socialist writer George Bernard Shaw famously said that all socialists are Tories. And it was a really interesting quote, and he was trying to be provocative when he said it. But he said it because what he was pointing to was the similarity in some socialist thought, particularly the Fabian socialism that Shaw was a part of, and conservatism. Both ideologies are paternalist in his view. Both Fabian socialism and conservatism have an idea that there are those who are in charge, those who are leading, but they have a responsibility for those who are less well off. And although the ideologies differ in what that responsibility might be, there are overlaps between ideologies. And Shaw was pointing to that in quite an interesting way. So bear that in mind when it comes to thinking about ideology, that ideologies are messy. There is a gap between how politicians justify themselves, the rhetoric they use, and the policies. And ideologies and institutions interrelate with one another. So that, particularly when it comes to the Conservative Party in Britain, the ideology of conservatism has been shaped by, and in turn shapes, the Conservative Party. So all of this mess and noise is going on in the background. And it's really important, I think, to get that complexity across when you're thinking about ideology.